did you stop?
I heard wolves howling. They howl around each other like a rope, usually around something that doesn't move.
Hopi girl tied to a tree for wild beasts until Cowboy spotted her and chose to face death rather than ride away. A Hopi girl is tied to a pole for wild beasts until a cowboy spots her and chooses to face death rather than ride away. The wind from the northeast blew across the mesa like winter's invisible hand, tearing at the pale gray sky. Each gust carried the smell of crushed dry grass and the sharp scent of some forgotten animal carcass in a ravine. I stood, or rather hung, from a weathered wooden post. The wood was split, the sap long dead, but it was still strong enough to hold me tight, a sentence no one spoke aloud but everyone understood. My wrists were pulled high above my head, the rope woven from yucca fibers chafing my skin until blood seeped out in dark streaks in the cold. Another rope bound my legs together, forcing me to stand straight like a useless marker in a desolate field. My earthen-colored cotton dress, the only thing left from the day I left home, was torn at one hip, exposing the thin, tanned line of my thigh muscles. The neckline of my dress had been yanked down, not because I wanted it, but by the one who tied me, leaving my collarbones bare in the cold afternoon light. The sun had long since gone, leaving only a light as thin as a torn shawl, not warm enough for anyone, nor golden enough to soothe the bruises on my skin. Each breath I exhaled came out like smoke, short and hurried. Not because I was afraid of death. Death in this land came like an old acquaintance, without bothering to knock, but because I was trying to keep my heart from racing, afraid it would let the wolves know how weak I was. They were there, among the low, thick sagebrush where the wind couldn't reach. I couldn't see their eyes clearly, but I could feel them, their patient, unhurried gaze, as if time were a river that never ran dry, and I was just a fish stranded in its bed. Whenever the wind paused, I heard the sound of claws scratching the frozen ground, the heavy breathing of a predator waiting for the feast to begin. I knew I hadn't been left here by chance. In the village, no one bothered to distinguish truth from a story repeated often enough. My cousin, my blood on the tribal registry, but as foreign as red sand after the rain, wanted my father's Springfield rifle. My father had placed it in my hands as he passed, a way of reminding me that memory and honor both have weight. But my cousin, with a story dirty enough for people to believe, said that I had sold myself to men who weren't Hopi. Those who wanted to believe did. Those who didn't want the trouble. And so here I was, with ropes, wolves, and an end that everyone deemed fitting. I had cried for less than this. But not today. Tears were a luxury in the winter desert, for they froze on my cheeks faster than hope melted in my heart. I stood, even though my shoulders ached as if hung with stones, and my calves shook like dry leaves in the wind. If this was how it ended, I wanted it to come while I was still standing tall, eyes open, not begging. The next gust of wind brought with it a long, low howl, which then grew higher, like a call from the edge of the world. It was answered by another howl, closer, and then closer still. I knew their game: tighten the circle, wait for the prey to lose strength, and then rush in from multiple directions. I closed my eyes, not to avoid the sight of them, but to remember. I remembered the autumn morning when my father taught me how to load the Springfield, his hands large and calloused, but as gentle as a touch on a kite. I remembered his voice, low and slow, telling me, "This is not just a gun. It's a reminder that you belong here." I had believed him, and it was that belief that brought me here now, to a place where I no longer belong. The sound of hoofbeats came unexpectedly, not the quick rhythm of a merchant or a hunter, but slow, heavy, with long pauses between steps, as if the rider were listening for something. I opened my eyes. A black silhouette stood against the gray sky, tall and thin, a wide-brimmed hat hiding half his face. The horse stopped some distance away, and the wolves snarled and retreated as a shot rang out, not a killing shot, but a warning. The bullet hit the ground right in front of the nearest wolf's snout. They scattered like broken clouds, but I knew they would return if the scent of blood lingered. The man dismounted. The crunch of his boots on the thin layer of ice and frozen ground was steady and unhurried. I didn't know who he was, where he came from, or why he had stopped here. He didn't ask. He didn't introduce himself. He just placed his knife blade under the rope on my wrist. The yucca fibers snapped with a dry crack, and my arm dropped like a dead branch, refusing to obey. My head swam, my vision blurred. Before my body could collapse, he caught me. The scent of his jacket was a mix of leather, smoke, and road dust. I steadied myself, leaning on my own strength instead of his. He knelt and cut the rope at my ankles, then stepped back as if to let me choose between running and staying. I didn't run, not because I trusted him, but because my knees had no strength left to take me anywhere. He offered me a canteen of water. I stared at it as if it might be a trap before I drank. The water was cold and sweet, and it flowed down my throat, warming my chest. When I handed it back, he placed his jacket over my shoulders. The buffalo hide lining was so warm I felt myself breathing again. He said nothing, only gestured toward his horse. I let him lift me onto the saddle, sitting in front. His hand wrapped around me, not to embrace me, but to keep me from falling. We rode away from the wooden post, leaving it behind like a milestone on a map I never wanted to return to. On the way, neither of us spoke. There was only the creaking of the saddle leather, the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves, and the sound of the wind seeming to fall behind us. With every mile, I felt my breath grow longer, but the question in my head remained short and sharp. Who are you? And what do you want from me? His cabin was nestled against the red cliff face like an animal that knew how to find shelter from the wind. The roof was low, and a wisp of smoke from the stovepipe rose like a thin thread, torn apart by the wind as soon as it took shape. When the door closed behind us, the sound of the wind immediately retreated, leaving only the sound of my heart beating in my chest like a dried-out drum, echoing everywhere. He slid the wooden bolt, hung his hat on a hook, and walked past me without casting a shadow on me. The way he moved, held things, opened and closed them, was as if everything in this room had its own order, and I was a strange object that had just fallen in, needing time to find its proper place. "Sit," he said, his voice low, not hoarse, and not soft. I sat on the edge of the bed. The thin mattress was sunken like a dry creek bed, and the smell of fur and firewood was a stinging mix. He poured water from a wooden bucket into a tin cup and gave it to me. The cold metal touched my lips, the water slid down my throat, and I heard a small sound from my throat, like a tree groaning when the wind blows through it in the dry season. He pulled a small box from under the table and took out a clean bandage and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. "It'll sting." I nodded. The whiskey touched the rope burns, and a fire ran under my skin. I clenched my teeth. The red-purple lines on my wrists smelled of heat, as if I had just put my hands in a furnace. He worked with steady, slow movements, not touching any skin he didn't need to. His hands were large with prominent knuckles, the hands of someone who fixes the world from small things, a sticking bolt, a squeaky hinge, a chipped bottle mouth. I saw a few mended stitches on the sleeve of his jacket, straight stitches, a pocket sewn up with rough hemp thread. The stitching wasn't pretty, but it was determined, just like the way he had looked at me since we met. Not eager, not retreating. When the bandage was finished, the stinging turned to numbness, and I noticed my hands were shaking, not from fear, but like an echo of the whole afternoon spent hanging there. He hung the whiskey bottle back in its place, struck a match, and lit a fire in the stove. The flames flared up sparingly, like a thrifty man opening his wallet, but it was enough to change the color of the room. I looked at the few objects: the roughly made wooden table, 2 chairs, a low shelf with jars of beans, coffee, salt, lamp oil. By the door was an axe leaning against the wall, its blade gray like a piece of ice. He reached into a hook, took down a buffalo-lined coat, and placed it on my shoulders. The weight of the coat made my shoulders drop, as if giving an order to the tremor. The hem of the coat touched my bruised collarbone, and I unconsciously pulled the collar up higher. He tilted his head, as if asking with his eyes, "Is it okay?" I nodded. The pot of beans on the stove began to bubble. The smell of beans, smoke, and familiar damp fabric took me back to another winter morning. My grandmother, sitting by the fire, sprinkling cornmeal with her hands, humming an old song about the wind finding its way through the canyon. I lifted a spoon, eating slowly, each spoonful a reminder of the strength in my arm. He didn't rush me, just ate with his own spoon, the silence as complete as a conversation. "Why did you stop?" I finally asked, my voice still with small stones falling out of my throat. "Heard the wolves," he said. "They were howling around each other like a rope, usually around something that isn't moving." He could have ridden away, I thought, but my lips only let out, "You could have just kept going." "Could have." He looked into the fire. "But it wouldn't have been right, Lou." It wasn't an answer to hang on the wall, nor an answer to write in stone. It just lay there between us, like a knife that had been wiped dry and placed on the table, seen but not touched. I had nothing more to say, and the silence of his hands was warm enough. Night fell as quickly as a heavy blanket. He placed a thick quilt on the bed, pointed to it, and spread his coat on the floor near the door. "I'll sleep here," he said. No explanation was needed. I lay on my side, the quilt pulled up to my chin, my eyes half open, watching him sit against the wall, cleaning his rifle like a person washing dishes after a meal. When he blew out the lamp, the cabin went silent, leaving only the sound of the wind outside like a storyteller, recounting things already known. I closed my eyes, not because I trusted him, but because fatigue had taken away my right to be vigilant. Before I fell into a deep sleep, I heard a long, low sigh from myself, like the slope behind the village leading to the cornfield. I woke up to the cold on my nose. The stove was only glowing coals. He was up before me, his silhouette cutting through the darkness like a thin knife. He stoked the fire, and the flames flared up, a streak of orange sweeping across the ceiling like a bird taking flight and landing again. I sat up, my back aching as if sanded, my wrists throbbing. He poured me a cup of black coffee. The steam rose, making my eyes wet without tears. "Sleep well?" he asked. "Well enough," I replied. Well enough was sufficient to avoid explaining that sometimes sleep is a late-arriving, early-departing enemy that leaves the battlefield messier than before. I hugged the mug, my elbow touching the cool tabletop, wood made of silent truths. I silently watched my hands over the rim of the cup. The purple lines around my wrists had begun to darken, the red edges bleeding like ink in water. He didn't ask who did it, why, or where are you from. He just pulled up a chair and sat across from me, looking out the window as if listening to a song changing its rhythm outside. After the meal, he stepped out into the yard. I stood in the doorway, the morning sun like a thin piece of glass on my cheek. It hadn't snowed last night, but the air still smelled of something about to change. He crouched by the corral, his fingers touching the frozen ground. The back of his jacket tensed, then relaxed. When he turned back, his face was the color of the earth, expressionless, but unable to hide what he had seen. "There are tracks," he said briefly. "How many?" "2. He looked toward the edge of the valley. "From last night. They passed by, slow, close enough to see smoke." An old wire in me tightened. My cousin didn't need to come himself. He didn't need to get his hands dirty. A simple nod in the darkness was enough. I pulled my collar tighter, clutching the quilt's hem like an old vow. He looked at me, not to ask, but to measure the distance between me and the truth in steps. "From now on," he said, "don't go out alone." I nodded and said, "I'm not something to hide in the dark." The corner of his mouth almost moved. "I know, but I don't want them to know you're here the way they do, Lou." At noon, he took a small pouch of bullets and a handful of cloth scraps from the shelf. "Have you shot a gun before?" he asked. I nodded. My father had put the Springfield in my hands before I was tall enough to reach his shoulder. The grooves on the barrel were his fingerprints left for me, detailed, precise, and never wrong. He handed me his Winchester. The metal in my hand felt like a live fish, cold and heavy. "Right shoulder," he said. "Forearm holds but doesn't squeeze. Cheek against the stock. Breathe out before you pull the trigger." I stood with my body angled the way he showed, my feet shoulder-width apart, my knees soft. The wind brushed my ear like a whisper. I aimed at a rock a few dozen paces away, inhaled, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil was so gentle it startled me. The rock didn't break, but the dust next to it flew up, like a letter being half opened. The second time, I adjusted the angle of the stock, paying attention to the pressure on my index finger. The rock chipped off a white fragment. "Enough," he said, "not praise, not criticism." But I felt a small seed fall to the ground. He didn't see me as a shadow. We boarded up the windows with planks, nailing them with a chipped hammer. The sound of the hammer was a new rhythm for the room. I watched him pull the shelf near the window, revealing a small compartment where spare bullet casings were neatly arranged like corn kernels after the harvest. He showed me the back door bolt, another wooden latch, low and hidden, which locked when slid sideways. "If I'm not here," he said, "bolt both. Bullets are here, water is here." He raised his hand, lightly touching the rim of the bucket. I repeated it in my head like a simple prayer. Bolt, bullets, water. In the afternoon, we chopped firewood. I held the axe. The smell of pine resin shot up my hands. The wood groaned, then split into two sighs. The heartwood stacked into a growing pile. I knew he was watching me from the corner of his eye. I said without turning my head, "You think I can't do it? I think you can." His voice was level, clipped, like a wire already taut, just waiting for someone else to tie onto it. When the sun set behind the cliff, the cabin's shadow stretched like a beached boat. He took a slow walk around the yard, his eyes scanning the edge of the valley. I stood in the doorway, my hand touching the hem of his coat, my fingertip touching a needle threaded in the pocket. I pulled out one of his shirts, a tear in the shoulder, and sat on the doorstep, threading a needle. The needle passing through the fabric brought a strange kind of peace, the peace that comes from mending something torn, even if it was just a piece of a shirt. I didn't ask if he needed it. I just did it, and I knew that tomorrow, when he put his arm in the sleeve, he would find my stitches exactly there. In the evening, he cooked a simple rabbit stew. I broke dry biscuits, dipped them in the broth, and felt my scalp relax a little, like a dried-out hide being softened by steam. Neither of us said anything lengthy, but in the silence between two spoons touching the rims of our bowls, there were stories that didn't need to be told. It was when he was spreading his coat on the wooden floor that I asked, "Your name?" He looked up. The lamplight made his eyes darker. "Luke." He said the name like a regular word, not bringing a story with it. I nodded, folded the shirt I had just mended, and placed it at the foot of the bed. "Thank you, Luke." I tried the name in my mouth. It sat there, not out of place. He nodded back, like two people who had just exchanged a small but meaningful object. When the lamp went out, darkness came, but not completely. The fire in the stove still burned, exhaling in a steady rhythm. I turned over, pulled the quilt up, my eyes open for a moment, watching Luke's silhouette stretched out on the floor, his rifle close to his ribs, his hand resting gently on the stock like an unspoken promise. That night, the wind changed direction. In the quiet between two gusts, I heard a sound as thin as a thread, very distant hoofbeats. I half sat up, my ears straining, looking toward the window. No silhouette, just the sound of something thinking about us. I lay back down, placed a hand on my chest, and felt my normal heartbeat return slowly. I didn't believe in peace yet, but I believed in concrete things. The bolt was latched, bullets were in the compartment, the bucket was half full of water, the coat on me was warm, and a new name had just been placed in the room. Luke. Before falling into the sleep that hovers on the edge of awareness, I whispered, very softly, as if speaking to myself but loud enough for the wind to hear, "Good night, Luke." There was no answer, but the darkness between us softened, like ground after a rain, enough to sow a different kind of seed tomorrow, the seed of staying. That morning opened with a strange silence. No crows circling the rim of the canyon, no new rabbit tracks on the soft ground by the corral. The absence of small things is always the earliest bell. I was mending another sleeve on Luke's shirt when I heard his boots stop outside. He stood there for a long time, not calling me, as if he were putting his ear to the chest of this land to hear its heart beat irregularly. I carefully lifted the curtain, peeking through a crack in the wood. 2 black dots on the horizon, slow enough not to be travelers, straight enough not to be lost. They came like 2 final punctuation marks of a threat. Luke turned his head and looked at the house. His gaze held no command, just a thin thread connecting me to the bolt on the back door. "I'm here," I said, my voice low, my hands already finding their way to where the Winchester leaned against the table. He nodded and walked out to the fence. His whole posture suddenly became that of a storm-proof pole. Not big, but in the right place. The 2 men stopped a few horse lengths from the fence, road dust falling from their heels like old scales. One man had a scar running from his cheekbone to his collarbone. The other wore a faded blue soldier's jacket, its buttons glinting like dead fish eyes. "Just asking around," the scarred man sneered, his voice as dry as gravel. "Heard you're sheltering a girl, black hair about this tall." He held his hand in the air as if measuring a person's shadow. "Haven't seen anyone new around here in months," Luke said, his voice like a piece of wood placed across a stream. "Maybe your informant mistook his own shadow." The soldier jacket man tilted his head, his eyes sliding across the porch, the cracks in the door, the walls. I felt that gaze touch me like a needle-piercing fabric without leaving a hole. I leaned my shoulder further against the wall, my fingers resting on the gun stock. The smell of pine resin on the sleeve Luke had mended, mixed with the dry smell of dust, led me back to that old thread. "Don't shake." "We heard a shot the other night," the scarred man said. "Not everyone shoots wolves like that. Must have a good reason." "My reasons aren't here for you to see," Luke replied, his eyes never leaving their hands near their hips. "The road behind you is still wide." A silence bloomed between the 3 men, like wet hide being dried. It stretched, then sagged. The soldier, jacket man, spat into the dirt. "We'll be back," he said, not as a threat, but as a weather report. "The road will be the same," Luke said, "but the answer won't change." When the 2 men were gone, Luke stood for a moment longer, his hand absently stroking the fence wire, as if the wood could tell him what was to come. I finally let out a breath, a sigh, long as a rope being untied from a tight knot. I opened the door and stepped into the yard. The ground under my feet no longer affirmed anything. It only took a mark without keeping a promise. "They're my cousin's men," I said. "The scar, I know it." Luke turned to me, his gaze settling on my face like a stone placed on the edge of a well, just heavy enough to hold, not heavy enough to sink. "Tonight we'll bolt both latches," he said, "and from now on, you don't step into the yard if I'm not there." "I'm not," I began. "I know," he cut in, not rudely, "but their eyes have seen this place. Let them see less." 2 days of silence, like a trap set in the bushes. Every creak of the roof, every peck of a crow's beak on a rock, broke into a signal. I sharpened a knife on the doorstep, the steel running back and forth like a narrow stream of water. Luke took a wide loop each afternoon, his rifle resting on his thigh like a habit. Inside, he showed me a small wooden wedge hidden in the window frame. Pull it out, and the entire frame could be dropped, sealing it shut. I repeated it 10 times, 20 times, until my fingers could find the wedge in the dark, as if finding the right note of a song. On the 3rd afternoon, dust rose from the trail, no longer 2 black dots, but a long streak like a cut in the air. 5 horses, 1 leading, 2 flanking, 2 on the wings. I didn't count with my eyes, but with my heartbeat. It increased by exactly 5 beats, then remained, strangely, as calm as when a person has made an unchangeable decision. "They're here," Luke said, standing by the door. He didn't tell me to hide. There was no need. I had picked up the Winchester before he even turned around. They stopped about 30 paces from the house. The lead man was tall, broad-shouldered, his hair tied with a deerskin thong. He smiled without showing his teeth, just squinting his eyes. That smile used to make people nod in the dark. Now it fell off his face like a flake of paint. "I see the wolves didn't get the job done," he said in English, his voice hard as unpolished stone, the language he used when he wanted outsiders to hear. Then he switched to Hopi, lashing me with his words, "You've done enough. Come home. I'll overlook the shame you brought to the village." I took a step forward. the rifle stock pressing against my shoulder like my lost father's hand. The smell of the stock's wood rose, mixed with the scent of an old autumn day, the day the Springfield was placed in my hands, with the sound of birds and a cornmill. "You lied," I said in our own language. "Not a statement, just a knife slid in fabric. You took my father's gun and said I sold myself. You wanted honor to fall silently like a straw, but it cried out." He tilted his head slightly, as if to laugh, but had no air. "Honor doesn't buy cornmeal, cousin." The word cousin in his mouth sounded like a snapping trap. "I'm not hungry," I said, "but you're about to be hungry for respect." The scarred man's hand twitched. The soldier jacket man gently pulled his reins. I heard the sound of Luke's tongue touching his teeth, a sound smaller than an ant, but it put me in the exact position I had chosen. He stood a half step in front of me, not to shield me, just to block them. "That gun isn't yours," Luke said to the lead man, his voice like a cold ledge on a rock face. "And neither is she." For a second, everything stopped breathing. The wind, the rains, the horse's foam, the sunlight. Then his jaw moved, very slightly. "We'll be back," he said. "More of us." "Whoever comes will hear the same thing," Luke replied. "It won't change." They pulled on their reins. The dust rose again, this time not a threat, but a promise. When the dust settled, I found myself still standing, the gun barrel still resting in my palm, cold sweat on my back like a stream suddenly shaded. Luke lowered his rifle, his hand lightly touching my elbow, not to comfort, but to measure the heat of a fever. "Tonight we'll add more boards," he said. "Bring the wood inside. Fill both buckets with water." I nodded. I didn't ask why. The answer was already running on the ground, clinging to the hoofprints like an animal that knows its way. As the sun folded behind the cliff, we placed the last planks over the windows. When the hammering stopped, the cabin was as silent as an ear filled with water. I pulled the Springfield from my memory and placed it on the table. No, its place was a void. What remained was my hand, heavier. "You could leave me here," I said, my eyes on the fire contracting and expanding in the stove. "Like people leave a rock by the side of the road, for others to kick." Luke was oiling the gun's action. "I've walked enough roads with rocks," he said. "I don't kick anymore." I laughed, a very small sound. It evaporated before it reached the ceiling. Outside, the wind changed direction, bringing the distant smell of burning wood from the southern rim. Someone had started a fire, someone close enough for the scent to reach us. I reached out to check the bullet in the chamber, a warm current flowing through my palm. Not courage, just a new habit that knew its way. Night fell like a bag cinched with a rope. We didn't say the word prepare, because our hands had already spoken. In the comfortable darkness of the room, I heard the sound of a horse's hooves for the first time. Not the tired rhythm of travel, but the cautious, tiptoeing pace of a man trying to write a small message through a keyhole. Luke lightly lifted the wooden bar on the front window and placed his eye in the narrow slit, no wider than a knife blade. I held my position on the side of the house, in the blind spot he had shown me. From here, a lone attacker would enter the line of sight. His voice came from the yard, soft as dry sand. "Luke Harland, I'll give you one more chance to return what's mine." He didn't use my name. He called me what's mine as if I were a lost horse. "I don't have anything that belongs to you," Luke said, "and I don't trade things for threats." A shadow moved between two clumps of sage, gliding like a fish through dark water. I held my breath until the sense of my own body drifted away from my skin, leaving only a taut wire connecting my eye, the gun barrel, and that dark patch. Luke's shot came first, splitting the night in two. The shadow dropped to the ground without a sound, like a sack of corn cut open. A horse's whinny tore the silence. I heard the sound of hooves. Another shadow cut across the corner of the cabin, entering my line of sight, as if to draw its own name on a slate. I squeezed the trigger. My shoulder recoiled, my wrist burned. The shadow was thrown backward, a cry disappearing under the horse's hooves. The smell of gunpowder filled my mouth, bitter and sweet, like the smell of an old secret. The two remaining shadows retreated out of range, hurling curses into the night, like stones into a deep well. He said nothing. He stood somewhere at the edge of the moonlight, letting silence do his work for him. Then the hoofbeats gradually faded, like waves receding from a pockmarked beach. I didn't lower my gun until Luke said, "It's all right." When I lowered the barrel, I finally let out all the air I had been holding. My stomach softened like ground after a hailstorm. I leaned my back against the wall, my head touching a wooden knot, feeling as if I had just pushed a heavy door over a threshold. "They'll be back," I said. "Not tonight," Luke replied. "And when they come back, they'll know this place isn't a bush." I laughed again, the sound traveling farther this time. I placed the gun on the table, my hand suddenly as light as if I had just paid off a debt. Luke added more wood to the stove. The flames flared up, gathering the cabin into an island. I looked at my hands. The bruises slowly changed color, like the sky changing its hues before a rooster crows. I placed my palms on the wooden table, feeling the warmth pass through, following the grain like reading the palm of a friend who had just returned. "You're not from the village," I said, as if speaking to the fire. "You're not my kin. But tonight, you stood where you were meant to stand." "Tonight, you did too," Luke said. Not praise, not comfort. A statement laid down without retraction. Outside, the wind carried the sound of wolves from very far away, their howls no longer circling a lonely post, but passing over the roof like a song with new lyrics. I pulled the quilt up to my shoulders and suddenly felt the fatigue recede from every fiber of my being. Luke sat back down in his place, wiping the oily rag on the gun barrel one more time, as a person would stroke the hair of a child who had just stopped crying. "Tomorrow," he said, his eyes never leaving the steel barrel, "we'll go get what's yours back." "I know the way," I replied. And in that sentence, I heard my father's voice again. "Walk your own path. Don't borrow someone else's." I looked into the stove. The fire breathed steadily. The cabin breathed steadily. My heart breathed steadily. And in a very deep corner, where the darkness usually reserved for nameless calls resides, a small sprout pushed through the earth, opening 2 thin leaves. I will not run anymore. I will step out, look straight ahead, and call out the name of the one who called me by the wrong name. That night, the moon rose like a silver coin placed in the palm of the desert. The cold light crept across the cabin roof, clinging to the edge of the planks, the bolt, and the gunstock resting on the table like a crouching animal. The wind stopped. The silence was as thick as dry wool. Luke turned down the lamp wick until the flame was only a breath. He pointed with his hand. I would be on the side, where the patch of darkness completely swallowed a person's silhouette. He would stay in front, the window crack opened only as wide as a knife blade. I checked everything I had been taught over the past few days. Bolt bullets, water, top bolt, bottom bolt. My eyes were used to the darkness. Shoulders relaxed, cheek against the stock. I could hear my heartbeat travel from my throat to my palm, each beat just enough to keep my index finger from shaking. Somewhere outside, horse hooves were feeling their way across the frozen ground, the sound dry and out of rhythm, like someone testing a familiar door. His voice came first, hollow and deliberate like a metal tray tapped lightly. "Luke Harland, give back what's mine. Nobody needs to bleed." He didn't use my name. He called me what's mine, as if I were a lost animal. "I don't keep what's yours," Luke replied, his voice low, clipped, echoing against the wood and returning with no aftertaste. "And there won't be any blood here tonight." A shadow glided across the yard, low like grass flattened by the wind. I held my breath, letting my sights cover that dark patch. Luke's shot fired first, a dry sound that cracked the night like a mirror. The shadow dropped without a cry. A horse whinnied, a rein whipped the air, and a curse was cut short by the wind. I saw another shadow skirt the left side of the cabin, the exact direction I was waiting for, and as it entered the frame, I squeezed the trigger while exhaling. My shoulder recoiled. The bitter smell of gunpowder hit my tongue. The shadow was thrown backward, falling from the saddle, kicking up dust like low-flying stars. "You think a few shots will end it?" My cousin's voice was strained from the far end of the yard, angry but calculating. "A wooden cabin burns fast." "I have water," Luke said, "and I have enough bullets to put out your fire." Another shot rang out, exploding somewhere near the fence, the sound of metal scraping rock. I held my position, slowly shifting my barrel, my eyes pressing into the night as if trying to read a line of text that had been erased multiple times. There was a very faint click at the back door. A man was flanking, an old habit of night prowlers. I knelt, leaning until my gun's shadow aligned with the shadow that just appeared. My second shot sliced through the silence, followed by a discordant groan. The entire yard shattered into patches of moonlight, patches of darkness, empty spaces where others thought they had disappeared. Luke didn't retreat or advance. He shifted his angle of view like a carpenter turning a piece of wood for the plane to follow the grain. On my side, no one else dared to come close. At the edge of the yard, a horse turned around, the reins flapping against its foamy mouth. He didn't make any more threats. His silence lasted just long enough for me to understand. He wasn't winning tonight. A few hoofbeats quietly retreated toward the edge of the valley. I didn't lower my gun until Luke softly said, "All right." His voice was as gentle as a touch on the gun's stock. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting my heartbeat find its normal rhythm again. My left hand rested on the back of my right, hot, damp, with the smell of gunpowder clinging to the creases. I heard a small pop from the coals in the stove, enough to know that the fire was still breathing steadily. "Tonight is over," Luke said, his eyes still at the window slit. "In the morning we'll follow the tracks. We'll get back what's yours." I nodded. The phrase "it has to end" didn't need to be said. It was already in the way. I placed the gun on the table, lightly, but not letting go. Outside, the wolves howled in a circle, their voices higher, farther away, the song ending a failed hunt. I relit the lamp wick. The flame turned a little yellow, just enough to see the stitches I had mended on Luke's jacket shoulder. The stitches were straight, each stitch a beat of resolve. The night closed with the sound of a wooden bolt being locked tight. I placed the Springfield next to the bed, my hand still smelling of iron and oil. Before my eyes closed, I saw in my mind the hoofprints on the ground, the way to read the direction, measure the distance, and know that the morning outside had already opened a path. Head toward the thin smoke. Early in the morning, the ground was cold like the shoulder of someone who had just woken from a fever. A thin layer of frost lay in the hollows, hiding a silver color under the dust. We went into the yard. Under last night's moon, the horse hooves had rewritten the story in bold strokes where one man fell. The dirt was loose like the inside of a biscuit. Where they turned, the rim of the hoof had scraped a small half-moon. 3 deep tracks led south, converging then splitting into a shallow ravine. Luke pointed with his chin. I placed my palm on the ground. The sand was cold and slick, but underneath there was a little warmth, like a hidden pulse. "Go," the hand of the earth said. We saddled the horses. The Springfield lay across my thigh, the newly woven yucca sling resting on my shoulder. The morning wind carried the smell of freshly cut pine resin and a little smoke from somewhere that refused to die out. The path wasn't a road, just a series of soft patches of ground connecting through sage and loose rock. Each time a horse's hoof came down, dust flew up in short breaths. We didn't speak. Words now were like heavy water spilled. They would leave a mark. At a hollow with a spring, smoke appeared against the sky, a thin, straight thread. Luke gestured for us to circle low behind large rocks. We tied the horses behind a mossy rock outcrop, walking with steps that didn't make the grass shed its seeds. When we stopped, about 30 paces from the camp, I saw 3 horses tied under a pinyon tree, 2 men sitting close to the fire, the third one separated, broad-shouldered, the deerskin thong in his hair. The Springfield lay across his thighs, as discreet as a story untold. He looked up when Luke spoke. "Put the gun down, hands away from your body." Luke's voice wasn't sharp, just steady, like a pole that had weathered many winds. The other 2 men froze by instinct. He wasn't in a hurry. He looked at me, just a quick glance, but it was enough to acknowledge that last night he had heard my name hissing in the trigger. I stepped out from the shadow of the rock, my shoulders straight, my father's Springfield waiting on the opposite side, in the hands of a man of the same blood but a different name. "I came to get what belongs to my father," I said in our language. Every word came out like a needle-piercing fabric in the right place. He sneered, but his voice no longer had its usual arrogance. You left the family yourself. That thing has passed through my hands. Your hands can only hold the belongings of the dead if the living agree, I replied, my eyes never leaving that honey-colored wood. I don't agree. For a fleeting